Good evening. Tonight's event is called Truth and Trauma. Representative Jamie Raskin and the Trials of American Democracy and a Family Tragedy. So welcome to all of you who are here, and I'm told hundreds who are watching online. 2 words, truth and trauma. Truth and trauma. These are important words for all of us now. So I'm Jim Wallace, the inaugural holder of the Chair in Faith and Justice. I love those 2 words. At the McCourt School of Public Policy and the founding director of the Center on Faith and Justice. On January 6th, 2021, a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol, seeking to disrupt the certification of the 2020 presidential election. And for 4 hours, these shock troops of the extreme right, as they have been called, incited by a former president, Donald Trump, engaged in violent combat with the Capitol Police. 5 people were killed and 140 members of the Capitol Police were injured. And with many of those injuries they continue on. It was the worst attack on the U.S. Capitol since the War of 1812, as many have said, and it was carried out by Americans, many of whom carried flags and crosses. Flags and crosses as they desecrated the temple of American democracy. The rioters who staged this coup, and clearly it was a coup, not just the day, as we'll hear tonight, but going on before and still going on. They did it in the name of Donald Trump's big lie, the big lie of a stolen election. Now, I want to say, and my students have heard me say this, there was a bigger lie, there is a bigger lie underneath the big lie, and that is the ideology of white Christian nationalism, which is a lie, and which makes January 6th, the insurrection, as much a moral and spiritual and theological issue as a political one. January 6th was, I believe, an offense to God, a sacrilege. That's what I believe. And January 6th almost dealt a death blow, we're learning, to our democracy, as California's District Court Judge David O. Carter wrote just last month in a ruling that represented the first time a federal court has found that Trump likely committed multiple felonies from the court. He said if his lawyer and President Trump's plan had worked, it would have permanently ended the peaceful transition of power undermining American democracy and the Constitution. Then he said, if the country does not commit to, 1, investigating and pursuing accountability for those responsible, Judge Carter said, the court fears January 6th will repeat itself. So tonight we are, I'll use my word, blessed to have Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is at the very center of the fight to investigate and pursue accountability for January 6th and to prevent that horrific day from repeating itself. Congressman Raskin was inside the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, just one day after burying his beloved son, Tommy, whom we are all now getting to know. Congressman Raskin hid inside the U.S. Capitol, separated from his daughter and new son-in-law, who fled from the gallery and were hiding under a desk themselves as the violent mob ransacked the Capitol. He is a constitutional law expert, an ardent defender of democracy, and Congressman Raskin soon, right after that, set out to rebuild what that mob tried to destroy and to hold perpetrators accountable. And what I was so moved by in reading his book, despite the fresh wound of a parent's loss of a son, Raskin was tapped by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to serve as the lead House manager in the second Senate impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump. And he said it was like a lifeline to him to help save his life. That ended in a 57-43 vote to convict the president for inciting a violent insurrection against the government to overthrow the 2020 election. Congressman Raskin drove here tonight from home. He's in his home district and drove over. Represents Maryland's 8th district. And he called this assignment he received the hardest thing I have ever been asked to do professionally at the most difficult time I have ever experienced personally. There's a model here, my friends, about public service and personal sacrifice and how they come together. Congressman Raskin's work in holding the people behind January 6th attempted coup is not over, as he'll say tonight. He now serves on the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, which plans to hold public hearings now this spring and publish a report on its findings in September. Prior to Congress, Raskin was a 3-term state senator in Maryland and a professor of constitutional law for more than a quarter century at American University, Washington College of Law. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. And he's authored several books, but this, including this new New York Times #1 bestseller, Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of an American Democracy. I couldn't put the book down. It's a long book, but I couldn't put it down. Try it. You'll find the same. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is a loving father, a patriot in both sunshine and stormy weather, and a champion in the fight for democracy that now lies ahead for all of us. Congressman, please join us.
Thank you.
He knows Washington well because he lives nearby. Most congressmen wouldn't drive to an event like this, but you did on your way over here. You made it.
I probably should have done Uber, actually, because it's tough parking on your campus.
Is it tough parking on this campus? Yeah? Well.
But I'm very psyched to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Jim.
Well, I'm blessed to have you. Let's take the following topics tonight in this order. First, the January 6th Select Committee to help us understand what's going on and what's going to go on. Second, the threats to democracy. And then this whole question, when I thought of you and what you're doing and your personal trauma in these days, the word resilience came to mind. We're going to need resiliency in our democracy and our lives. And I think you can speak to what kind of resiliency can save democracy. So you said January 6th was not the final act, but perhaps the prologue to a titanic struggle between democracy and violent authoritarianism in America. So could you provide an overview of the committee, what you're doing? You said tell the whole story. I love this, the whole story of the violent insurrection and attempted coup. What are the maybe puzzle pieces you're still looking for? And what can we expect in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, the committee really wasn't supposed to exist because the Democrats and Republicans had negotiated for an independent outside commission modeled after the 9/11 commission with no elected officials on it, no members of Congress.
All
and
formers.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, looking for people who had been attorney generals in the past or secretaries of state or, distinguished figures in their own right. And I did have a sinking feeling that if it didn't end up with an outside commission, I was going to end up being on it, having led the impeachment effort in the Senate. So the Republican negotiator, John Katko from upstate New York, asked for a committee of exactly even appointees, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, equal subpoena power, equal staffing power. And the Democrats agreed to it. Yeah. Benny Thompson agreed to it. And so we were all very excited. We thought this would be a commission that would have tremendous bipartisan support across the country, and it would do its job. And then it got vetoed by the 4th branch of government, Donald Trump, who told the GOP he didn't want any investigation at all of the insurrection against us. And amazingly, the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, agreed, and they pulled the plug on the whole thing. And that's how we ended up with the bipartisan select committee within the House of Representatives. So we've done our best to create a very strong, powerful, focused committee. We've got a chair, Benny Thompson, who's a Democrat. We got a vice chair, Liz Cheney, a Republican from Wyoming. It's bipartisan. In fact, it's the most bipartisan committee I've ever been on because we don't spend the first hour or the entire hearings and meetings consumed with partisan polemics and denunciation and mutual recrimination, which is basically what goes on in most of the committees. So that's how we're structured, and we're going to have hearings in June, and we're hoping to have our report out by the end of the summer, or, early fall. And we're going to do what we've been asked to do by House Resolution 503, which is to define the events of January 6th, the causes behind them, and then to set forth recommendations for legislative strategies to prevent future coups and insurrections and subversion of American constitutional democracy. So that's what we're going to do. I mean, if are you asking me to tell you a little bit of what we found so far?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I would encourage people, you're going to have to watch the hearings because the hearings will tell a story that will really blow the roof off the House because it is a story of the most heinous and dastardly political offense ever organized by a president and his followers and his entourage in the history of the United States. No president has ever come close to doing what happened here in terms of trying to organize an inside coup to overthrow an election and bypass the constitutional order. And then also use a violent insurrection made up of domestic violent extremist groups, white nationalist, racist, fascist groups in order to support the coup. And that will be the story that people hear. And so, think of what happened on that day in kind of 3 circles of sedition. There was a mass protest called for wild purposes, as the president put it, of tens of thousands of people that turned into a mob riot, which injured more than 150 officers who ended up with broken jaws, broken necks, broken shoulders, arms, lost fingers, broken legs, crushed toes, traumatic brain injuries, concussions, and post-traumatic stress syndrome in dozens of people. I mean, I have constituents who are officers who go in for physical therapy twice a week and mental therapy once a week right now. So, that was the outside ring, and then the middle ring was the ring of the insurrection, the domestic violent extremist groups like the Proud Boys, who Donald Trump had told to stand back and stand by at the first presidential debate, the Oath Keepers, the 3 percenters who've been charged with seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government, and the QAnon networks, the militia groups, the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nations, and some white Christian nationalist groups,
right,
as you were saying. And then the scariest ring, that was not the scariest ring, the scariest ring was the ring of the coup. The insurrectionists were in charge of attacking our officers, smashing our windows, breaking down our doors, interrupting the peaceful transfer of power and shutting down the counting of electoral college votes. But the ring of the coup, and I know it's a strange word to use in American political parlance because we don't have a lot of experience with coups in American history, and this was not a coup directed at the president. It was a coup directed by the president against the vice president and against the Congress. And Donald Trump simply did not accept the results of the election. He was preparing his followers not to accept the result of the election. He was going around the country saying, the only way I can lose is if the election is stolen.
right.
And we know that this was false because more than 60 federal and state judges all across the land, including 8 judges nominated to the bench by Donald Trump, rejected every allegation of electoral fraud and corruption advanced by them. But they proceeded to try 5 or 6 different strategies to overthrow Joe Biden's majority in the Electoral College. And then finally, it all came down to January 6th. And the basic idea was, we're going to get Pence to assert unilateral, extra-constitutional, unlawful powers to reject and repudiate electoral college votes being sent in by the states, specifically Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Why? Well, they would lower Biden's total from 306 to below 270. And by the way, the electoral college split in 2020, 306 to 232, was the exact same margin that Trump had in 2016, which he had declared a landslide in 2016. But in any event, they were going to try to get Biden's vote total below 270 to activate the 12th Amendment, which says if nobody has a majority in the Electoral College, then the contest shifts immediately to the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election, where the House decides who will be president. And you say, well, why would they want Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic majority to decide who's going to be president? They understood under the 12th Amendment that we're not voting one member, one vote. We're voting one state, one vote. And so there were 27 state delegations controlled by the GOP, 22 that the Democrats have, and Pennsylvania, which is split 9-9, would have been to the sidelines. So even had they suffered the defection of my new best friend in Congress, the at-large representative from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, they still would have had 26 votes in the bag to get the majority to seize the presidency. And at that point, they likely would have invoked the Insurrection Act, as Trump's disgraced former National Security Advisor Mike Pence was urging him to do. I mean, not Mike Pence, Mike Flynn. Forgive me, Michael Flynn was urging him to do that, and then he would have declared martial law.
Because there would have been protests if that had happened.
There would have been mass protests, but also, the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers were running around Washington saying, Antifa, where are you, Antifa? Right. They clearly were looking for somebody to fight to create some visual images of this just being a square, some kind of showdown between left and right, and it would have been, Donald Trump's opportunity to come in and be the hero. It would have been his Reichstag moment. I'm going to save you from the insurrectionary chaos I unleashed against you. And even to this day, they say Nancy Pelosi couldn't keep order in the House. She, instead of denouncing this violent insurrection, totally unprecedented in American history, with tens of thousands of people besieging police officers and violent armed mobs smashing our doors and windows, they say Nancy Pelosi messed up because she wasn't ready for it. And that's what they were prepared to do. Donald Trump would return as the conquering hero, just ignoring the 7.5 million vote margin that Biden had in his victory in the Electoral College.
I wrote down this quote. it could blow the roof off the house.
Yeah.
And you're describing now how that could have happened. I recall in the book, you have a fascinating narrative of when you and your chief of staff were driving in that day, how crazy it was on the outside, the language, the threats, the fingers in the air, the attacking people. But it seemed like crazy outside. You were focused on the inside battle and what you were going to say, getting ready for that. But you said later, you weren't prepared that all of that would come into the inside. We want to watch the hearings very deliberately because we're getting bits and pieces from you and other members. Unpack what you just said about the rings, the three rings, because you say some of that when you report this in the press. It's very important. Also, how rising fascism likes conflict. They want conflict. That's their goal, to create conflict and then come in and take over. The outside ring, name the three rings, and my big question is, what have you found about the coordination between the three rings? Were they connected, organized, and how so?
They were, and I think we will be offering evidence to that fact. But they were coordinated most tightly by Trump and his inner circle, the inner entourage around him. And of course, that is the place we've had the most difficulty. I mean, we've had more than 800 witnesses come forward to tell us what they saw, what they heard, what was going on with them. And these are witnesses on all sides. I mean, these are officers and these are rioters. These are extremist insurrectionists. These are White House employees. But the closer you get to Trump, the more they refuse to testify. And why isn't that enough alone to create a scandal in the country that we have a guy, like Mark Meadows, who was the chief of staff to the president of the United States, who now refuses to testify? Or Steve Bannon, who wasn't even an employee of the White House, but is trying to assert somebody else's executive privilege. Yeah. I mean, it's just the most fraudulent enterprise in the world. We've got a class of people who really think they're above the law and they're beyond the law. It's a really dangerous thing for a democracy to have a class of people feel so entitled by their power, their wealth, their connections, that they can just defy the rule of law like this.
And you call Trump and the associates the center ring, which is very important. On that day, we're all aware of the Proud Boys.
The way to understand it is the inside deal was to get Pence to play along with him. And Pence, who, to my mind, I'll lay my partisan cards on the table, for 4 years demonstrated nothing other than invertebrate sycophancy and obsequiousness to Donald Trump. On that day, he lived up to his oath of office, and he was a constitutional patriot, and he was. And they were chanting, I heard them chanting, hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence, and they meant it. They'd set up a scaffold outside and a noose outside. So when his Secret Service agents, including one of them who was carrying the nuclear football with him, were chased out by these neo-fascists, and they ran down to some still undisclosed mysterious place in the Capitol. He uttered what I think are the 6 most chilling words of this entire thing I've seen so far. He said, I'm not getting in that car, because the Secret Service agents, who presumably are reporting to Trump's Secret Service agents, were trying to spirit him off of the campus. And he said, I'm not getting in that car until we count the Electoral College votes. He knew exactly what this inside coup they had planned for was going to do. And by the way, the political scientists have a name for this kind of coup. Most coups, the ones we think of, are the military trying to overthrow a president. The political scientists call this a self-coup, where you have an incumbent president who tries to overthrow the constitutional order by defeating the electoral process in order to prevent an election defeat. And there are examples of other people who've engaged in these kinds of self-coups.
So you'll tell this story in your hearings. And you can't tell us all that now, I know, but you're saying you found evidence that these three rings are connected,
are
coordinated,
intertwined. Were intertwined. And they were most intertwined, of course, in the mind of Donald Trump,
Right.
who was pulling the strings of essentially all of them. I mean, he was playing to his crowds and turning them into a mob with the social media and with his speeches, where he said, you know, when there's cheating involved, all the rules are off. You can play by very different rules, and you got to fight, and you got to fight like hell, or you're not going to have a country anymore, and so on. I mean, we had robust, bipartisan, bicameral majorities find, as a matter of legislative fact, that he had engaged in incitement to violent insurrection in the Union. He beat the constitutional odds for a conviction, but that was the most sweeping bipartisan Senate vote in a presidential impeachment in history. There have only been 4 of them: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton for doing you know what, and Trump 1 and Trump 2. And it was a 57-43 vote, finding that he'd engaged in it. So he feels somehow vindicated that only 57 of 100 senators found that he was the first president in the history of the United States to try to overthrow his own government. Great.
So in terms of what we're watching for, how these are intertwined is going to be very important to look for and watch for. This outside ring of the protests, social media, during the riots,
the insurrection was used as a way to delay and prolong the proceedings, along with the challenges to particular state electoral college votes being cast, in order to intensify the pressure on Mike Pence. They thought that at a certain point he would break. And once he broke and returned those electoral college votes, they could swing it through the 12th Amendment into a contingent election, and they would have run it like a political convention. They would have had, each state get up and cast their vote.
And they'd have had the majority.
Yeah, and at that point, it's anybody's guess what could have happened. Martial law, civil war, the beginning of authoritarianism. I mean, this judge that you cited, Judge Carter from California, said that it probably would have been the permanent end of the peaceful transfer of power in America.
So I hope we're hearing here what a close call we had here, a very close call, and agreeing with your colorful language on Pence. In hindsight, I was surprised that he didn't succumb to pressure. And you said his oath of office he upheld, which also happened when Trump tried to pressure state leaders in Georgia. So the oath of office kept some Republicans, from going along with this coup.
There are real constitutional heroes and patriots throughout this story. Because the first thing they did after all of the cases flopped was to try to get Republican legislative leaders in state legislatures simply to exercise their power under Article 2 to nullify the popular vote and cast their electoral college votes for Trump. And they refused to do it for different reasons. I mean, some thought that it was politically toxic, it was too hot, and others just thought it was the wrong thing to do. So then Trump decided what we'll do is we'll intimidate and browbeat the election officials to get them to change the vote totals. And we found dozens of examples of them trying to do this in the swing states, but most infamously, of course, with Georgia, with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who taped the call. And Trump said to him, all we're asking for, all I want is for you to find me 11,781 votes. I mean, I'm a politician. All I want is for you to find me 11,781 votes. I mean, that's not Donald Trump trying to stop election fraud. That's Donald Trump trying to commit election fraud and getting caught red-handed doing it, which is why the Forsyth County prosecutors are investigating that case.
That phrase, find me the votes, says it all.
Just find me the votes. I mean, it makes a mockery out of democracy. I hope that gets people's hackles up. So, that failed. Then, the next step was Michael Flynn telling people, let's just have the military go and seize the election machinery, and then the military can rerun the election. And all of you guys know that part of the Constitution which allows the military just to go seize the election machines and rerun the election, right? But they didn't care about that. He wanted to just assert emergency powers like we're, a banana republic dictatorship, which is basically what they had planned for us. And so that's why it all came down to January 6th. I want people to pay attention to what's going on here, because it's as close to fascism as I ever want my country to come to again.
So here's what Michael Ludwig, who's a conservative lawyer,
Judge, now lawyer,
Yeah, now judge. Here's what he said about this effort to decertify. He said, at the moment, there is no other way to say it. This is the clearest and most present danger to democracy.
Well, it is. Now, the danger for us, of course, on our committee is that we fight the last battle. I mean, I don't think the way we're going to lose democracy in 2024 is to have Vice President Harris unilaterally reject electoral college votes. I don't think anybody thinks that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But what is going to happen is there are dozens of voter suppression statutes that have been passed around the country. Georgia's got a new statute that makes it a crime to pass somebody a bottle of water while they're waiting in line to vote.
Yeah.
And they're trying to repeal early voting, they're trying to repeal weekend voting, they're trying to undo mail-in balloting. They're trying to create the mechanisms for election subversion where if they don't suppress enough votes and they still lose it, then there are enough new statutes out there where they can claim something went wrong, and then you appeal it, not to a bipartisan board or a court, but you appeal it to the governor or you appeal it to a state legislature. That's what they're trying to do in a whole bunch of states right now. They're trying to create a structure where they can't lose because of the mechanisms of appeal. So, this is something that's going to have to be fought all over the country. Mm-hmm. And the good news is the vast majority of Americans reject this. The vast majority of Americans believe that the truth must be the condition of democracy. They don't believe in the big lie. They don't believe in conspiracy theory and propaganda and disinformation. But it's a race. It's a race between the majority will and people's belief in democracy against a bag of tricks that includes voter suppression, the use of the filibuster, which is the most anti-democratic implement they've got to shut down all of our voting rights legislation. We passed the For the People Act in the House to get rid of gerrymandering, to protect the right to vote, and we just ran into a brick wall with the filibuster and the hold in the Senate. So they've got voter suppression, they've got the filibuster, they've got the gerrymandering of our districts, which is overwhelmingly a partisan enterprise at this point. And then we've got really extreme right-wing judicial activism and court packing taking place. So that's what we're up against. But I'm with John Dewey, who said the only solution to the ills of democracy is more democracy, because what's threatening us today is not democracy, it's all of these impediments to majority will.
As we were talking before this session, I was recalling my home state of Michigan, where many of these laws are threatened to be passed. They're redrawing the lines for districts, they're gerrymandering. And our lead organizer, this is Faiths United to Save Democracy. You can look us up, I've talked about them before. We're in 10 key states. And I was telling you that our lead organizer there says in Michigan, if all of these laws pass, these drawing the lines, they'll move from 17 black legislators from Lansing to Washington, 17 to 5. 17 to 5. So they're redrawing the lines, and often this isn't getting the attention that it needs, the voter suppression laws, because people say one party's doing voter restriction, the other's against it, so it must be just partisan. Yeah. And we've got to focus on how we get the attention of people about what would you say, this is an effort to, in fact, turn back our democracy. How do we do that? How do
It
we
is,
get...
well, yeah, I mean, the partisan thing is very difficult because this obviously goes way beyond political party. This is why I always reserve special praise for Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and Mitt Romney and those constitutional patriots who are Republicans who say this cannot be the organizing principle of the Republican Party, the big lie. But of course, it's not operating like a modern political party now. It's operating like an authoritarian religious or political cult of personality,
right,
where Donald Trump dictates to everyone what they're going to believe. But it is amazing. I don't know that there's anything like it. Maybe the know-nothings, but it's very hard to think of any comparable experience in American history where an entire political party organizes itself around a lie about who won and lost an election. I mean, that's a pretty remarkable thing. I mean, my party just lost an election for governor of Virginia, and we were very unhappy about it because we think it was based on lies about critical race theory and so on. But we didn't go and beat up a bunch of cops and smash them in the face with American flags and take over the Virginia state capitol. And much less did we go around lying about it. We said, okay, it didn't work out well for us. We'll be ready for them next time when they tell lies about critical race theory. But the same thing, happened in 2016, where 1 million people came to Washington to protest because of Vladimir Putin's cyber sabotage and cyber subversion during the campaign and Donald Trump's, rank misogyny. And 1 million people gathered, but what did they do? They didn't commit violence.
They protested.
They put on pink hats and joined Indivisible, but that's a very different thing. This is a grave moment for American democracy.
I think we have to understand the structural character of the problem. You have strong feelings about the Electoral College, which you called a haunted mansion starting in the basement with white supremacy. Now, there was, to me, something quite ironic about it. The mob of white supremacists, who I call them, who attacked the Capitol, trying to stop a process in the Electoral College that has enshrined white supremacy in the country. So the Electoral College is skewed, is structured.
Well, you got to understand the way that the Electoral College was intertwined with the 3/5 clause when the country started.
Right.
So, of course, the Constitution did not create or protect the right to vote. It was left to the state legislatures. Right. And, of course, the Southern legislatures didn't give any African Americans the right to vote. The overwhelming number of them, if not all of them, were slaves at that point. And they were not given the right to vote, much less run for office or anything else. But for the purposes of census reapportionment and creating congressional delegations, the Southern states were adamant that the slave population be counted for the purposes of defining the number of representatives that would be apportioned. And for these purposes, the Northern states said, wait a second, you're not allowing these people to vote, you're treating them like property. They can't run for office. Why should they count at all for the purposes of reapportionment? And of course, the slave states were willing to walk over the whole thing, and they went back and forth, and finally they arrived at the infamous 3/5 compromise. The irony, of course, is that today we think the 3/5 compromise is such a pernicious and insidious statement because it's saying that an African American is 60% of a person, but it was the most progressive forces who were saying, don't count the black population at all if you're not going to allow them to vote. And it was the most racist forces in the country saying for these purposes, they should count completely. But they settled at this 60% solution, and it inflated the Southern delegations by more than a dozen members after the 1800 census and reapportionment took place. And it was, so then, of course, it translates from the number of members in the House delegation to the Electoral College, because as you know, the Electoral College number of a state is defined by 2 for the US senators, plus the number of representatives. So there were an extra dozen electoral college votes that came from the southern states because of the 3/5 compromise, and that's why Thomas Jefferson, who for all of his other virtues, was the candidate of the slave states, and he was called at that point Negro president, meaning not that he was sympathetic to the black population, but that he was elected by the votes of 600,000 or 700,000, well, really 1 million enslaved human beings who got treated like 600,000 citizens for these purposes. And you got to check out Gary Wills's great book on the subject called Negro President, which tells the whole story. But it's part of the lost history of our country that people don't know, and that, of course, they want to make it a crime to teach because it might hurt somebody's feelings. But really, they don't want the real history of political white supremacy or violent white supremacy to be known in our country. And we've got to understand it, because if we don't understand our past, there's no chance we're going to be able to get the future right.
And the system, which I wish we had more time to talk about tonight, from Electoral College to how state legislatures are skewed to rural white populations, like in my home state of Michigan, or the Senate itself. The system is skewed. And then you have these movements rising up based on resentment and hate. And Stephen Levitsky, who's the Harvard historian, who wrote the book How Democracies Die, says democratic backsliding begins at the ballot box. And he told me he talked to US senators before the filibuster vote, trying to explain, and they just didn't get it. They didn't seem to understand, as he said, that the House is on fire. Then Madeleine Albright, who you quoted, saying, fascism is not a political system, it's a tactic. So how are they using tactics and strategy?
So, well, I mean, just to complete the point on the Electoral College, it's obviously profoundly undemocratic. It's given us 5 popular vote losers in our history, including twice in this century, in 2000 and 2016. Never forget, Hillary beat him by more than 3 million votes in 2016. And it creates bizarre incentives, because the whole general election comes down to 7 or 8 swing states, because the vast majority of the country lives in safe red states or safe blue states, and it's not based on size. It's just based on the mere, arbitrariness of whether you have relatively similar numbers of Democrats and Republicans. But the real thing today is that the Electoral College has become a positive danger to the Republic, because if you have a strategic bad faith actor like Donald Trump out there, he can transform every nook and cranny in this antiquated Byzantine system into another opportunity to sabotage the democracy.
I want you
and even to unleash violence.
The specific bad faith actor, you quoted Alexander Hamilton, the first Federalist paper, is saying he warned against an opportunistic demagogue unleashing a violent mob and primitive impulses against the Constitution.
That's in the first Federalist paper.
Right.
The very first one. That's why I said at the impeachment trial, Donald Trump doesn't know a lot about the founders, but they knew a lot about him.
Well, but that's not history, that's happened now. What he warned against has happened now.
Yes.
So it's no longer history, it's what's happening now. So this bad faith actor, this demagogue, has unleashed this violence with what he called primitive impulses. How confident are you in the resilience of our constitutional system?
Well, I still believe, despite everything that's happened since the 2020 election and with Donald Trump, that we are still we have a very strong claim to being the world's greatest multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious constitutional democracy that ever existed. But that lives in the hearts of the people. because we've seen how fragile the institutions are. We can be overrun. Nobody can afford to be complacent at this moment. Tocqueville said in Democracy in America, I don't know if that's a book anybody reads anymore. Do you guys read that in college? But there's a striking passage in there where Tocqueville says that that voting rights and democracy in America are always either shrinking and shriveling away, or they're expanding and they're growing. And we've been in a contractionary period. There's a war on people's voting rights. There's an attempt to shrink democracy taking place, and we got to get back on the growth track. It's not enough to just defend nervously the structure we've got. We got to look at why democracy's been languishing. I mean, you guys are sitting in a city where there's 713,000 tax-paying, draftable American citizens who are not represented in their own national legislature, and you're the only people on earth who are in that situation, right? And so, we need statehood for people in Washington. We need statehood for 3.5 million disenfranchised American citizens in Puerto Rico. We need to restore voting rights to all the former prisoners, which I think 42 states have done, but we have 7 or 8 states that continue to disenfranchise people who've gotten out of prison and who have every other right restored to them except the right to vote. And that's got nothing to do with rehabilitation or reform. It's about voter suppression and strategic manipulation of the electorate. So we got to get back on the democracy growth path fast, because it's real dangerous what's going on out there.
The word resilience is what came to me from reading your book, and you got personal. And speaking of resilience, you say you're devoting your fight for democracy to your son, Tommy, who you lost on December. You and your wife, Sarah Bloom Raskin, described Tommy as somebody who possessed a perfect heart, a perfect soul, and a dazzling, radiant mind. And I feel like I've gotten to know him reading your amazing book. You also suffered from depression, a struggle that is all too common in the US and around the world, and especially among students. And I'm hearing about this more and more on this campus from my students who are talking to each other about this, and it's a topic in an election conversation just a couple nights ago here, including students who are listening to this, who are students anxious about the rise of fascism and climate change and gross economic inequality, as your son, that hurt him deeply personally, and police violence, all the rest. How is the mental health crisis, and we have one, and the political crisis, how are they connected?
Well, I think in just the way you described it, Jim, in an authoritarian society, in a Putin kind of society, in an El-Sisi society, the health of the population, especially the mental and emotional health of the population, is basically irrelevant. If anything, a healthy population is a threat to the power elites, to the people who run the society. In a democracy, we need everybody to be physically and mentally and emotionally healthy so we can govern ourselves. Democracy isn't just the Congress or the state legislature. I mean, it's county councils, it's city councils, it's town councils, it's school boards, it's student government, it's newspapers, it's the media, it's civic life. That's a real democracy. That's what Tocqueville saw when he came here.
That's right.
The 3 most important words of the Constitution are "we the people." It's our democracy. So we need people to be healthy. And I believe, I don't know if you guys have read Christopher Wiley's book about working for Cambridge Analytica and Putin and Bannon and Trump in 2016. You got to read it, because people tell me they're feeling depressed, and of course everybody is on their own odyssey in terms of mental and emotional health, but a lot of people who don't have a clinical diagnosis are feeling depressed, sad, disenchanted, pessimistic. That is a strategy. Read that book. and see how there was a deliberate effort to use the social media to demoralize people, to isolate people. They knew that they weren't going to get liberal college kids to vote for Donald Trump, but they could depress the hell out of them and make them feel like everything's hopeless and don't get involved in government and don't get involved in politics. And that's precisely what I hear. So when people tell me that now, I say, congratulations, because you are fulfilling Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump's most ardent dreams, that they will activate the most unstable, fanatical people in the country. And we saw it in Charlottesville in 2017, and we saw them come back in full force on January 6, 2021, and they'll depress the hell out of everybody else, even though we're talking about the vast majority of the population. Your generation should have a revolution against what Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are trying to do to your society. And I know how depressed everybody is about climate change and about the inequalities and about police violence and so on. But this is your country. It's your future. So, you know, I think about my kids. Tommy was depressed. He had a struggle, but everybody's depression, everybody's anxiety exists in a social context. And the COVID-19 period was brutal. Donald Trump nearly turned us into a failed state. A failed state is a state that cannot deliver the basic goods of existence to its people. And in terms of public health, the most critical thing in a public health campaign is social cohesion. And they wrecked it. They destroyed it. They fed the public lies about COVID-19, conspiracy theories about COVID-19. They attacked the scientists. They ruined our prospects for defeating the disease. And Donald Trump's own COVID-19 coordinator, Dr. Deborah Birx, said that hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives unnecessarily because of the decisions that their administration made. So, you know, we lost Tommy on the last day of 2020, one of the bleakest, darkest, most depressing years of American history. And, you know, I wrote my book as a love letter to my son and as a love letter to my country. And we've lost our son, but we don't want to lose our country too.
Your father, Marcus Raskin, who I knew a little bit, I was very close to his partner, Dick Barnett, in starting the Institute of Politics, the first think tank in DC. And he famously said, democracy needs a ground to stand on. I like that. And you're talking about how do we create the ground that public, social, relational health is necessary. And he said, and that ground, your father said, is the truth. The truth.
Is the truth. And I've come to really see the insight of that statement because I believe that today the struggle to defend democracy is the struggle just to tell the truth against all the lies.
And we're dealing with a political party that seems to have broken completely with the truth, but also with reality. It's just another reality they're trying to, and you know, to quote my tradition, Jesus said in John, you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And the opposite of that is, if you don't know the truth, you'll stay captive. To me, that's a critical text about the truth. And you're known in the Congress as a truth teller. And so how do we as a society have the courage to stand up in wherever we're influential and tell the truth, which is really, your dad says, this is the ground on which we have to build democracy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it basically starts everywhere. You know, I think almost everyone has friends or family who have fallen victim to propaganda, conspiracy theory, disinformation, misinformation. Right. And so it starts there. and then more aggressively going out and telling people what the truth is. But I guess what I'm saying is, don't be shy about telling the truths that you understand and rejecting the lies. Donald Trump, he knew this was a lie. He knew he was going to lose, and he knew that he lost, and still continues to propound that lie, which is so deeply divisive and corrosive of democratic institutions.
I was talking to a student yesterday, a Georgetown student, about sometimes what happens to students who know all the facts, who know the truth, and how I was saying that sometimes the greatest enemy for people who really know or should know the truth is cynicism, and how cynicism is a privilege that people have. Some people can't stop trying as they're trying to survive. But how do we fight that kind of cynicism? And again, to your dad, he said, when everything looks hopeless, I love this, you are the hope. So what would you say to these students tonight about their being the hope? What does that mean?
I feel they're the hope. I feel this young generation is the hope. They're beyond racism, they're beyond anti-Semitism, they're beyond misogyny, they're beyond immigrant bashing, they're beyond fascism. All the ghosts and monsters of the 20th century that they want to bring back, this generation rejects. They're also a little bit beyond grammar too, but that's a different problem. I think very highly of your generation, and we need you to stand up and fight with everything that you've got. But you also need to connect to the generations of the past that fought for America, because you would not be the first one to do it. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, they saw a fascist marching down the street in Europe. They didn't see very fine people on both sides of the street. They knew exactly which side of the street we needed to be fighting on. And the Civil Rights Movement, which was young people, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which transformed Mississippi and toppled apartheid in America. Young people have been at the forefront of it. That's why, I've turned my political campaigns over to young people. I spend no money on consultants, on pollsters, TV, radio, direct mail, none of it. I have a democracy summer project where I invite high school and college kids to come work with me. We study the history of social change in America, and then they go out and they register voters and they organize. This summer I think we'll have more than 1,000 across the country. This is what I think we need them for. When you're talking about truth, Tommy had a favorite passage from Wittgenstein that he used to cite, where Wittgenstein said, the test of the validity of an empirical proposition is whether it corresponds to reality. The test of the validity of an analytical proposition is whether it corresponds to the laws of logic. But he said the test of the validity of an ethical proposition is the courage with which you act in the world to make it real.
That's a quote.
So democracy is an ethical proposition.
Amen.
It is the political system that tries to elevate the needs and the interests and the agenda, the values of everybody, to include everybody, as opposed to just the people who can seize power and seize wealth over everybody else. So that's the ethical proposition that you guys need to fight for with your courage.
So I teach the ethics course at McCourt. So there's a good truth. Ethics is not just analysis or data. It's whether you act on what you say you believe. So I could talk to him all night, but we've saved 30 minutes for questions for you all. There are 2 microphones, like you've heard me say before. The key to recognizing a question is that it's a question. I know sermons, and sermons are different than questions. So I'd like you to begin to line up at the microphones with your questions. And we have a half hour for the congressman to give you answers to your questions. So please, don't be shy.
I don't mind a sermon. They can just say, "Isn't that true?" at the end of it. So.
Or we could just say amen. We could just do that.
Yeah.
While they're lining up, let me ask you one of the questions that's a current political question coming up a lot. On your committee, you don't prosecute people. But you refer things to the department. They'll all see your report. There's a big discussion going on about whether the Department of Justice will move quickly enough to prosecute the people who are the perpetrators, or whether it's a slow-moving process like the old mafia trials, bottom up. And you're in the middle of that. Are you hopeful? Are you about moving patient, slowly, or one of your colleagues says, we've done our job, they should do theirs? So what do you feel about the process going on between your committee and the DOJ?
I mean, I'm a little bit of a conservative about that because I think one of the traditions and principles that Donald Trump destroyed was the idea of the political branches being respectful of the independence of the law enforcement function. And I think we should publish and put out there all of the facts and all the evidence we find, but I don't want to browbeat and try to coerce them into doing something. I mean, they've got jobs to do, and I think they can do their jobs. And besides, Merrick Garland's my constituent. I don't beat up on my constituents. So.
Good point. Now, if you're a student, I'd love you to say your name and maybe what school you're in, your major, whatever. And let's start here.
Hi, I'm Blaine. I'm a freshman in the college studying government. You're actually my representative, so I'm very happy to see you here today.
Where do you live?
Silver Spring.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Where in Silver Spring do you live?
Off of East West Highway.
Nice. That's the heart of Raskin country right there.
Right there, yeah. I'm just wondering, as a gov major, I know a lot of us are looking to work in public service as you do. What tangible advice do you have for us on maintaining our mental health in a field that can be very stressful and
That's funny.
taxing?
Yeah. Did you go to Blair?
No, I went to Georgetown visitation.
At a visitation? Oh, good. Well, I mean, stick to the truth. I've got some colleagues whose mental health I'm really worried about. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene was heckling me last week. I brought down contempt citations against Peter Navarro and Dan Scavino, and then she started chanting, Russia hoax, Russia hoax. And then it's very distracting when someone's just yelling, Russia hoax at you, and you're trying to speak. And so I think the speaker was about to have her removed. I said, no, let's keep her here, because in a week when Putin's army is raping women and killing them and leaving their bodies in the street and shooting children in the head, I'd like the world to see that I've got Republican colleagues who are chanting Russia hoax, and see where the Trump-Putin axis is taking them. But I'm really concerned about what it does to people to feed themselves on lies. And I do think they're acting much more like members of a religious cult. I have literally been consulting deprogrammers to try to figure out how to talk to them and how to pull them away. And basically the deprogrammers say you have to be as warm and affectionate and as personable as you can be with them and make them remember what life was like before they got into the cult. But you have to be very emphatic about what the truth is and what facts are versus what is just derangement, And I've told some of them, I'm like, if you guys don't get out of this, you're going to be fit when it's all over, only to be selling incense and flowers at Dulles Airport. You will end up sleeping on the floor and listening to tapes all night because they've abandoned critical thinking skills.
And you're kind of asking how, as a student who aspires to this vocation, how do you get ready for that personally, mentally, emotionally, and not just study the facts and analysis, but, right?
Right.
How do you get ready personally for that? How do you prepare yourself?
Well, yeah. I'd say read a lot about our history, so you know who's come before you. Surround yourself with your close friends. I spoke over at GW and some students asked me, what should we do? We're very stressed out about the situation. And I said, well, one piece of advice I'll give you is what I tell the little kids in soccer. Don't bunch. Not everybody needs to live in DuPont Circle or Brooklyn. Go back to South Carolina, go back to Montana and take your 20 best friends with you. Like, spread out because of the nature of the federal system here.
I
You stay in Silver Spring.
I tell my students all the time. I quote a Catholic contemplative at Georgetown. Usually people don't know who he is. Thomas Merton said, "Everything is about relationships." That's true on every level. Keep that in mind. Here, tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Karina Shaw. I am currently a student at Georgetown Law School. I asked at the front if I could share a little bit about myself. I didn't want to make it too much, and she said it was okay, so I'm going to lead with my personal narrative. My family's drawn a lot of inspiration from your family because on January 1st, 2021, I lost my brother, who was just 26. He was struggling also with mental health issues. And it's been undeniably difficult and tough. And I picked myself back up, and I'm now working in health law policy, so I'm going to be at O'Neill this summer. And I just wanted to know from you what is necessarily going on the Hill, where I should look, because I know you're really interested in this work off of, what you've seen. I know U.S. Senator Ron Wyden is really interested because I know his brother was suffering too. And, my brother is really going to be informing a lot of work I've done. And I just want to know where to look because mental health policy, mental health work, this is still new. And I want to be part of the solution. And it really hurts to not have him here, but this is how I'm also recovering in grief. And I just want to hear a little bit about from you. And it's really nice to meet you in person. And
Well, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
And I'm very, very sorry about your loss. And that, I know how hard it's been on our daughters to be without their brother. And so I can only imagine what you're going through.
I just had only one brother, so it's just, it's, but I just want to know what I can do to be part of the solution and where I can look, because it does give me a lot of life really if I can even, if we can work on some policy to even save one life, I think I'll consider myself successful. It's just worth it. It's, mental health is a public health issue. In class, I'm writing my final paper on the Mental Health Parity Act. Enforcement's an issue. So just where should I be looking? Where we should all be looking, really,
Yeah, I think everybody's struggling to figure it out because we're engulfed in this huge crisis. It's a time of trauma where we've lost nearly 1 million people in COVID-19, comparable numbers in the opioid crisis, and now we've got this mental health crisis, which, the only real silver lining is that if you've got a majority of young people reporting symptoms of depression and anxiety, it's hard to stigmatize it when it affects most people. And so there's much more conversation about it, which is good. But I would say, we'd probably have to have a longer conversation because I don't know, at what level you want to intervene. But obviously there are, peer-to-peer counseling programs that most colleges and universities have if you really, want to help particular people who are struggling. I'm sure there's tons of people you could help on campus. But in terms of public policy, this is something being addressed at the local level, at the state levels, and also at the national level. The ideal of mental health parity is one that has been honored in the breach, really, only. It's funny when you think about it. If we say, well, we want mental health, you have the same access to mental health that you have to physical health, but of course there are tens of millions of people who don't have access to medical health. And we have just tremendous staffing shortages of mental health providers, of doctors and psychiatric social workers, and so on. And most of them now are just taking private clients because they can earn a lot more money that way. And so it's very difficult even for insurance plans to get doctors and psychiatric social workers to operate within networks. And then, of course, there's millions of people who aren't even in networks at all. So it's a serious crisis. So, I encourage anyone who's thinking of maybe going into that as a field to think about that. because it's a very serious problem. But then I would say beyond all of that, it's kind of what I was saying before, we're each on a personal psychological odyssey in our lives. But at the same time, we all exist in a social context. And so we've got to change the environment so it's not so brutal and hard on everybody, but especially the people who are struggling with mental and emotional health. And I do think that politics is part of the solution. You got to get involved in politics and demonstrate support and solidarity for people and show people some practical hope. We can get things done.
Okay, excellent. Over here.
Thank you so much for being here, Congressman. I'm Zach Fodiatis. I'm an undergraduate sophomore studying international history at the School of Foreign Service. And my question, without being too ambiguous here, has to do with sort of the dichotomous nature of extracting constitutional wisdom and applying it to our present ills. You know, today you talked about how, on the one hand, there are many aspects of our of the features of our founding, like how I believe it was the first Federalist paper, about how the founding fathers sort of predicted the rise of demagogues like Donald Trump in the present day. But at the same time, there are certainly aspects of constitutional, development in history, like the role of white supremacy in forming the Electoral College. And so I guess my question is, how do we best understand, in the context of social change, how to extract insight from the Constitution, from our founders, while also transcending certain aspects of it to promote justice?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but I mean, you just have to recognize that politics existed in the past just the way that it exists today. And no constitution, no document is perfect in any way. And, I always liked Lincoln's image when he was asked about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. He said, well, the Constitution is like the silver frame for democracy, but the golden apple is freedom and liberty. And that's what he said was embodied in the ideals of the Declaration, which, of course, paradoxically was written by a slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson. But nonetheless, he put the ideas into the Declaration of the unalienable rights of the people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that everybody is created equal. But he said all men are created equal, but we get the idea of the consent of the governed, and so on. And it's been successive generations of Americans that have taken those radical ideas, democracy is a very radical idea, and then translated it in their own generation. So just, maintain your critical thinking skills, and you can just read Hamilton or Madison or Ben Franklin or even my beloved Tom Paine with a critical eye and say, I like what he's saying there, or I don't like what this person's saying. And then you've got to read, of course, the next generations of Democratic patriots that came along. Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and the people in the civil rights movement, Bob Moses. People have struggled to make the ideals of the country real so people can lead lives of equal freedom. So you don't have to condemn our history. You also don't have to sanitize and whitewash our history. You just have to read it and use your mind and your heart to analyze it.
Thank you, Congressman.
Great answer to a great question. I would say that your imagination is what will fulfill those founding writers, and they wouldn't have imagined what these students would want to do. So it's your imagination that will fulfill those promises. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, Congressman Raskin. I wanted to ask you a question tonight about how we can begin to understand the psychological process, or begin to understand why so many Americans still support the Republican Party, which for the most part still wants to clamp down on voting rights, and for the most part rejects any investigation into what happened on January 6th. You mentioned yourself that the vast majority of Americans believe that it was a sham, that the big lie is a sham. And so my question for you is, how can we reconcile the fact that the vast majority of Americans believe that it was a sham, but still continue to vote for candidates, and for the party that, frankly, is anti-democratic, and if takes back the House in the fall, will likely shut down any efforts for further investigation? Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the question. Well, let's start with this. There are some people who believe in the Republican Party who are fighting for the soul of the Republican Party, like Liz Cheney, like Adam Kinzinger, like the 7 Republicans in the Senate, or at least some of those, who are still fighting to keep alive Lincoln's party, as opposed to Trump's cult. And that's, the struggle there. But I understand your question is basically about where the vast majority of the people in the Republican Party are and why it is they're buying the propaganda. And I mean, it's a complicated question. I'm not sure I totally understand it. I mean, in my book, I venture a suggestion that there are some underlying tectonic shifts going on in the country. I mean, it's hard to find an example of a country that had been majority of one race that then goes to being no race in the majority, but pluralistic without violence. I mean, the closest I suppose you could say is South Africa, but there was a lot of violence in South Africa, before the regime decided we're gonna move to a one person, one vote democracy. So there's no doubt that Donald Trump has figured out how to inflame people's fear and anxiety about race issues. And that's what, all the nonsense about critical race theory is really about. I mean, it's not critical race theory, which they barely even teach it in law school anymore, much less 3rd grade. It's critical race facts that they're worried about. And specifically, critical facts about white supremacy, like the Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court determined that the African American has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And the Constitution is a white man's document. And so it always amuses me when my Republican colleagues get up and say, there are people out there claiming that America was founded on racism and that's integral to our institutions. That's precisely what the Supreme Court said. Unfortunately, it was a Marylander, Chief Justice Taney, who wrote that. But I agree with them that it's not right, because there were radicals like Tom Paine and Ben Franklin who were abolitionists who said, we can't do this. But they don't even want you to be able to teach that that was the Supreme Court's position, So I think that's part of it. And then part of it is the social media and the propaganda, where people think if you see something repeated enough, it's got to be true. I mean, the human mind is a pretty fragile instrument, I've come to find, and a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol and were involved in that bloody violence were people who really thought that the election was being stolen. So just consider that. Donald Trump didn't, to be clear. The people around Donald Trump didn't. They knew it was a fraud. But a lot of the people that they drew to Washington really believed that they were fighting for democracy, not to destroy it. They thought that they were fighting, potentially involved in lethal violence, shutting down our constitutional processes because democracy was in danger and they were going to stop the steal. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty sobering thing when you think about it, mm-hmm. that you can indoctrinate people to engage in the exact opposite of what they think they're doing.
Over here.
Good evening, Congressman. Thank you for coming to campus. I'm Luke. I'm a freshman in the college looking to major in math from the Boston area. And I guess I hate to even ask this question, but do you think that the findings of the January 6th committee will move the needle of the public against? Because it feels like everyone's kind of moved on. I know people haven't, but it feels like people want to talk about inflation or gas prices, yeah, and not about the attack on democracy. And so do you think this will move the needle? I hope it will.
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, we have to do a good job of telling the story to people and making it compelling and relevant to them. I think a lot of it does relate to how young people, younger generations react to it. I know people are concerned always about the material facets of existence, about about inflation and about infrastructure, where I think my party has a very great story to tell about how the other party talked about infrastructure for 4 years. We actually came up with a plan and organized it and passed a $1.9 trillion investment in the roads and the highways and the metros and the ports and the airports and universal broadband. We did that, and we are fighting for Build Back Better. We are fighting to lower prescription drug prices. We are fighting for the investment in climate change and alternative renewable energies. We're fighting for universal pre-K. We got a real program. The other party, they went to their convention in 2020. They didn't even adopt a platform. They came out and said, we don't have a platform. Well, that's the first time in modern political history, as far as I could find, when that happened. And what does it tell you? Their platform is whatever Donald Trump tells them their platform is. Whatever he says, that's what goes. And the real agenda is voter suppression. It's just staying in power. And that's why I invoked Madeleine Albright, who said that fascism doesn't begin with a defined ideological content. Fascism begins just as a strategy for taking power and saying whatever needs to be said. And the one question I get most when I go out campaigning is, well, why are they so good at messaging and our side can't message as well? And I don't know the right answer to that, although I did come up with a message, which is to tell the young people everything you need to know about politics is everything you need to know about driving. If you want to go forward, you put it in D. If you want to go backwards, you put it in R. So you can get your license and you can learn how to vote at the same time. How's that for a simple message? But I think that the reality is that fascism always has a simpler message, because what's it looking for? It's looking for a scapegoat. So it's the Mexican immigrants who are rapists, or it's critical race theory, or now it's the groomers. That's why people are talking about gay rights, because they're trying to groom your child or what have you. Well, that's a very simple message. I just got 3 of them out in less than 10 seconds, But if you've got a message which is, how are we going to govern ourselves? How are we going to deal with climate change? How are we going to take care of little kids and nourish their minds when they're 3 years old? And how do we take on big pharma to lower prescription drug prices? You got to have a conversation. So that's why in my Democracy Summer, we try to come up with simple messages as much as we can, but really we're involved in the process of education, which is what all of you guys are doing here too.
Thank you.
I see 3 more. We're going to do all 3. So I'm asking you to be brief and, okay. There's a 4th.
Line, but I don't have to.
Okay, very quickly.
Yes, I'm not a student. I don't have a major. But I couldn't resist, Congressman. Given the situation we're in, I wanted to ask you, are there legislative fixes, or at the end of the day, does saving our democracy come down to people respecting the rule of law and norms and cultural norms and the like?
Well, it's got to be both, of course, and our report will have a whole series of recommendations of changes in law, maybe even in the Constitution, I don't know, that need to be made in order to defend ourselves, to arm ourselves strongly against unstable political arrangements and violent insurrectionary attacks and political coups. So it's going to be everything from, well, I don't know, because we haven't settled on that, but what I see, we need shatterproof windows at the base level of the Capitol. We got to look at the Electoral Count Act. We have to look at the danger of the Electoral College. We have to guarantee the right to vote. As I was saying, we don't have an affirmative universal constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote and guaranteeing that the majority will be vindicated. So there are a lot of different things that we have to deal with, and it'll be an interesting test of the unity of our committee, which has been very unified up until now, whether we can agree about a whole series of recommendations moving forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hello. Is this too loud?
You're fine.
Okay, I'm Samantha Baldwin. I'm over at the McCourt School of Public Policy. I wanted to ask, I know that there's a lot of young people, particularly on the left, maybe on the right, but I wouldn't know, today, which is part of the problem, who see so much rotting in American democracy today that they really only see a solution in civil war, which is just heartbreaking. What would you say to them to give them hope that it doesn't take violence to really restore Americans' soul?
Well, yeah, I mean, I get this question about revolution and civil war from young people, you know, and my dad always used to say that if you think of the idea of political revolution in cosmological terms, a revolution just brings you right back to where you are, right? And you know, the American War of Independence was a revolution in that sense. When you think about slavery or some of the other oppressive arrangements, it brought us back to where we are. But it did begin with those amazing ideals that were embodied in the Declaration and a cultural commitment to democracy that was unleashed. But the real American progressive tradition is embodied in the idea of Reconstruction, which is you take the raw materials of what's there and you rebuild from there. And Reconstruction is enormously controversial. The white supremacists and the racists have always hated it. And you know, people who are property conservatives or reactionaries hate the idea of Reconstruction, which posits that property is of legal and social definition rather than just having a natural meaning, you know. But I think that Reconstruction is going to be the promising way to think about what we need to do. It's hard for me to imagine that civil war could end up producing anything positive for us other than, you know, a bloody disaster. And, you know, we haven't really talked much about it tonight, but we need to save the democracy so we can save the species by confronting climate change. But we know that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have no interest in that. They are riding the carbon economy out all the way to catastrophe for humanity. So just like democracy is in danger all over the earth, our people are in danger all over the earth because of climate change. So the struggle for democracy must succeed, and then it must become a struggle to defend our species. We have to find the people who really think humanity is something worth saving.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Two more.
Thank you, Congressman and Professor Wallace. I'm curious, when you've interviewed people or they've testified, if anyone has, in the act of having to go over their actions, whether they were in the Trump administration or close to him, has anyone sort of shifted their perspective throughout, like, perhaps hours of testifying? Or do you think maybe some people are testifying in a way that's different than their public opinion? I'm just curious if you've seen any change throughout testifying.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't think I'm allowed to answer that question, really. But I will say that, I mean, there are certainly insurrectionists who have repented of their participation in the violent assault on the officers in the Capitol and the Congress. And, you know, there was a guy who was just convicted of destruction of federal property and I think theft of federal property. He decided to steal a coat rack for some reason. But anyway, his defense was basically, I did exactly what the president told me to do. And I'm perfectly willing to believe that, but the jury found and the court also found that that's not an excuse. It's like some people commit crimes and say, God made me do it, or the devil made me do it, or the president made me do it, but you're legally responsible. I mean, if you want to plead insanity, you plead insanity, but he wasn't pleading insanity. He was saying someone else told me to do it. If you rob a bank and you say, oh, well, you know, my brother told me to do it, or my best friend told me to do it, that's not an excuse. It's not a defense to the crime. So I think a lot of people who were involved in it see what Donald Trump is all about. He's all about Donald Trump. I mean, here he is. This is something that I spoke about briefly at the trial because my daughter Hannah brought it up with me. You know, Hannah said, you know, how can he send other people's moms and dads into that situation? I mean, there were insurrectionists who were saying goodbye to their kids like they would never see them again. Right. And how can he put them in that situation? And then he merrily skips off and won't even testify at trial to defend what he did. I mean, that's a pretty shocking thing. And now he's out there saying, oh, I really wish I had gone on the march. I really wish I was there with you. And he said, I will be there with you. I mean, there were insurrectionists who were there that day who thought Donald Trump was in the crowd. And they thought that they were invited there. I mean, there were officers telling them to turn around, and they were saying, the President of the United States told us to be here. Like, he's got more power than you. He's got more power than the Congress, and he told us to be here, so we have a right to be here. And the day afterwards, you know, there's still blood all over the Capitol and other stuff all over the Capitol. There were multiple calls received in Speaker Pelosi's office, people calling in saying, oh, do you guys have a lost and found? Because I think I left my phone there yesterday, or I left my baseball cap or whatever, like this was like a Civil War reenactment or a rock concert or something. But there were people there who believed that they were operating with the authority of the President of the United States because he stage managed the entire thing.
Final question.
All right. My name is Kalissa. Thank you for being here. You write in your book about friendship as a solution to partisanship. And I know one of the things you mentioned was changing the seating arrangement, which I think is an excellent idea in Congress. But do you think it's more of a grassroots effort where it's like people like me making friends and building individual relationships? Or do you think that we could or should implement larger programs, like maybe a national civil service program, just to build a sense of camaraderie between Americans that doesn't seem to exist? And also one thing I'll tack on in light of what you said is, like, do we all need to start deprogramming people who have been sucked into this cult?
Well, I think my answer is yes to everything you said there. I mean, I think it's incumbent upon all of us. I quote Tommy, who taught Sunday school, who told his kids, everybody should try to make friends with somebody you don't agree with. But that's pretty good advice, I think, for all of us. I've certainly tried to make a practice of that in the legislative assemblies that I've served in. That idea obviously does undercut the idea of militantly opposed partisan factions that are engaged in some kind of death match together. So, yeah, I think that rediscovering those, you know, mystical chords of affection and those bonds that Lincoln talked about, I think that's important. You know, I'm somebody who believes that the rules that we use make a big difference. I mean, I'm the sponsor of legislation for ranked choice voting all across the country, which guarantees that the people who win, say in, you know, if you use ranked choice voting in presidential primaries, it guarantees that the people who win will have a majority of support. You know, ranked choice voting says if nobody has 50%, everybody has voted their first choice, their second choice, their third choice, their fourth choice, and you redistribute the ballots to see who's the first one to get past 50. And that strongly diminishes negative campaigning, because now instead of trying to character assassinate your opponents, the incentive is for you to say, oh, well, you know, you love Jim Wallace, that's great, I love him too, but could I have your second vote or your third vote? And so it promotes coalitional politics rather than divisive politics. So I think we should be doing those things that promote nonviolent and coalitional democracy rather than winner-take-all vicious negative politics.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful conclusion. There's one thing I've heard you say that I disagree with. You were being interviewed by somebody and they said, why are you on TV all the time? And you said something like, well, the Constitution is my thing, and that's the thing now, so it's kind of my time, my thing. Well, that was kind of a funny answer, but I think the reason your voice is being lifted up is because you have become a model of public service, and that's why a lot of you are here. Public service and also sacrifice, service and sacrifice. And that makes you, I think, a model of hope for a lot of us. And you make us understand this battle for democracy is not over, won't be over with hearings or a report, with the next election. The people who say the last election was stolen and were wrong are trying to steal the next two. They say that openly. It'll take all of us to stop that from happening. We've had a conversation tonight. It was wonderful. A conversation America needs to have. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want us all to thank our dear friend who is a model for a lot of things that we believe in, Congressman Jamie Raskin.